4 years in Whispering Peaks National Park, and the routine was the new mission. Check the trailheads, log the wildlife sightings, make sure the city folk hadn't tried to pet a grizzly again. Order. That's what I'd sought after the core, and that's what I'd found in the rigid, predictable cycles of nature. The chaos of Fallujah had been replaced by the quiet majesty of the Montana Rockies. Here, the threats were tangible. A sudden blizzard, a cornered mountain lion, a misstep on a scree slope. Things you could see, anticipate, and react to. Things that made sense. My name is Caleb Hayes. I'm 32, and my life is measured in the miles I drive and hike through these mountains. The Park Service insignia on my sleeve feels more a part of me now than the eagle, globe, and anchor ever did. Beside me, John Devereaux shifted, his gaze not on the road but scanning the dense lodgepole pine forest that pressed in on us. At 58, John had the weathered face of a man who'd spent more time with trees than people, and the keen, intelligent eyes of the biologist he used to be. He'd traded a tenured position at Montana State for this patrol truck, claiming he was tired of studying God's work through a microscope when you can stand right in the middle of the cathedral. He was the park's resident mystic, the guy who could tell a storm was coming by the way the aspen leaves turned their silver undersides to the sky. "They're running quiet today," John murmured, his voice a low rumble. "Who's running quiet?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the winding path. The deer, the elk. Saw their tracks crossing the lower meadow heading south. They shouldn't be. Not this early. Not this fast. I grunted. John was always seeing portents in the patterns of animal droppings. I was the pragmatist. Animals were unpredictable. That was their nature. But lately, even my pragmatism was being tested. The quiet majesty of the park had been curdling into something sinister. It started 2 months ago. A young couple from California hiking the Granite Spire Trail. Their rental car was found at the trailhead, empty. No sign of them. A month later, a group of 3 college kids on spring break. Same trail, same result. 2 weeks ago, another couple, experienced hikers from Oregon, vanished. A total of 7 people, swallowed whole by the wilderness. The official line was a tragic confluence of unfortunate events. They got lost. They fell. A particularly aggressive grizzly was in the area. We'd all heard the theories, repeated them to nervous tourists and insistent news crews until the words felt hollow and meaningless. I remembered the search and rescue operations. The first one was the largest. 100 volunteers, state troopers and rangers like me, forming long lines and combing the terrain foot by agonizing foot. We shouted names until our throats were raw, the sound swallowed by the immense, indifferent wilderness. The helicopters came next, their rotors beating the air into a frenzy, their thermal cameras painting the forest in ghostly shades of hot and cold. Nothing. Then came the canine units. That's when the first real crack appeared in my logical world. The dogs were useless. Worse, they were terrified. I'd worked with search and rescue hounds before. They were fearless, driven machines. These dogs, a mix of German shepherds and bloodhounds, whined and tucked their tails. They'd catch a scent, start tracking, and then freeze. The hackles on their backs raised stiff. Their handlers were baffled. The dogs kept looking back and forth, from the dense undergrowth ahead to the sheer rock faces of Granite Spire looming above us. It was the strangest thing. It wasn't that they couldn't find a trail. It was like they were finding 2, coming from different directions, both belonging to something that smelled like pure death. They refused to go deeper into the woods around the spire, planting their paws and resisting the pull of their leashes with all their might. "It's not a bear, Caleb," John said, as if reading my thoughts. We'd had this conversation a dozen times, usually ending with me shrugging it off. "Still carrying that old boat anchor?" he asked, nodding at the Glock 22 on my hip. "Yeah, they still haven't gotten around to swapping out my old .40 after the service-wide switch," I replied. "Suits me fine. I trust the bigger punch." "What else could it be, John?" I countered. The words rote by now. "Mountain lion? A whole pack of them? The territory is over 600,000 acres. It's easy to get lost and never be found." "There's no sign of a struggle," he insisted, turning to face me, his eyes intense. "Not a torn backpack, not a discarded water bottle, not a drop of blood. A bear attack is messy. A cougar drag would leave a trail. These people, they just cease to exist. Their footprints lead up the trail and then they just stop, as if they were plucked right off the ground." I tapped the gear selector, dropping the automatic transmission down a gear as we began the climb toward the higher elevations, the engine groaning in protest. "You're being dramatic." "Am I?" He leaned forward, pointing through the windshield. "Every single one of them, Caleb. All 7. They signed the trail register. Destination: Granite Spire. It's the one common denominator. It's the most popular difficult hike in the park. It's a statistical probability." John shook his head, a grim set to his mouth. "There's more. I was digging through the old park archives. Ranger logs from the 50s and 60s, before the last of the native wolf packs were officially wiped out in this region." He paused, letting the silence hang in the cab. "The old-timers, they kept reporting sightings of anomalously large canids in the Granite Spire sector. Gray wolves the size of small ponies, they said. The official reports dismissed it as local folklore. Tall tales." "Because it probably was," I said, though a sliver of unease worked its way under my skin. "Maybe," John conceded. "But a week after the college kids went missing, I found tracks up on the ridge north of the spire. They weren't bear. They weren't wolf, not any wolf I've ever seen documented. The stride was too long, the print too deep, bigger than any wolf print on record." He lowered his voice. "And the rear paw print, Caleb. The way the heel pad pressed into the mud, it looked almost plantigrade, almost like a human footprint, if a human had claws." I laughed, but the sound was hollow. "Now you're talking about werewolves, John. You've been reading too many cheap paperbacks." He didn't smile. "I'm talking about what I saw. I'm a biologist, Caleb. I believe in evidence. And the evidence is telling me that there's a predator in this park that isn't in any of our books." We drove on in silence. The sun began its slow descent, painting the undersides of the clouds in fiery shades of orange and purple. We pulled over at a scenic overlook, a routine stop to end our patrol. Below us, the valley unfurled like a map, a tapestry of dark green forest and winding silver rivers. The jagged peaks, including the dark tooth of Granite Spire, were silhouetted against the dying light. For 4 years, this view had brought me a profound sense of peace, a feeling of being a small but necessary part of something vast and beautiful. Tonight, for the first time, it felt different. The beauty was still there, but it was a cold, predatory beauty. As the shadows deepened in the valleys and crept up the mountainsides, I felt a strange, unfamiliar prickle on the back of my neck. It felt like the park was holding its breath. It felt like it was watching us. The following day, the heat was a physical weight, pressing down and silencing the usual forest chatter. The air was thick and still, smelling of hot pine needles and dry earth. We'd parked the truck near Miller's Creek, a shallow, fast-moving stream in the foothills, miles away from Granite Spire. I was leaning against the fender, sipping lukewarm water from my canteen, enjoying the respite. John wasn't relaxing. He stood a few feet away, perfectly still, his head cocked as if listening to a frequency I couldn't hear. His eyes weren't on the landscape. They were fixed on the canopy of a towering ponderosa pine about 50 feet away. "What is it now?" I asked, my voice edged with a weariness that had been building for weeks. "A squirrel with a bad attitude?" "Shh." He raised a hand, not taking his eyes off the tree. "Look, on that lower branch." I followed his gaze. Perched on a thick pine limb was a Steller's jay. It was a common enough sight, a handsome bird with a crest of dark feathers and a body of brilliant blue. But this one was wrong. It wasn't hopping or pecking or calling out with its typical harsh, scolding cry. It was just sitting there, its head tilted at a curious angle, its small black bead of an eye fixed directly on us. No, not on us. On me. "It's just a bird, John," I said, though a faint, irrational chill traced a path down my spine. The intensity of its stare was unnerving. "Just watch," he whispered. John took 3 slow, deliberate steps to his left. The bird didn't flinch. It didn't startle. Its head just swiveled smoothly as if mounted on a well-oiled gimbal, its gaze remaining locked on him. He took 4 steps to the right, crossing back in front of me. The jay's head tracked him perfectly, a silent blue sentinel. There was no curiosity in its movements, no animalistic twitchiness. It was cold, mechanical, and utterly focused. It was the look of a surveillance camera, not a living creature. "Okay, that's creepy," I admitted, pushing myself off the truck. The heat suddenly felt oppressive. "Hey, get out of here!" I yelled, waving my arms. A normal bird would have exploded into a flutter of panicked feathers. This one didn't move. It just watched. The silence that followed my shout was profound, broken only by the gurgle of the creek. John's face was pale. He bent down, picked up a flat, palm-sized stone, and without a word, skipped it towards the bird. It wasn't an aggressive throw, more of a test. The stone clattered against the branch just inches from the jay's feet. The bird still didn't cry out. It didn't flee. It simply launched itself from the branch in a single, silent motion, rose about 10 feet, and settled on a higher limb, and resumed its unblinking surveillance. "Let's go," John said, his voice tight. "Now." We didn't speak on the drive back to the ranger station. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a flash of blue keeping pace with the truck. The feeling of being watched didn't leave us. It clung to my skin like humidity, a constant, low-level hum of anxiety. That evening marked a turning point for John. The quiet, observant biologist retreated into a state of near-paranoid obsession. He barely spoke during dinner, his eyes constantly darting towards the windows. Afterwards, he locked himself in his small bedroom at the back of our shared cabin. I could hear the frantic scratching of a pen on paper, punctuated by long silences, then more furious writing. Later that night, unable to sleep, I walked past his room on my way to the kitchen. The door was ajar, and I saw him hunched over his desk, his field lamp casting a stark circle of light on his work. It wasn't just a journal anymore. He had a large topographical map of the park spread out, pinned with colored thumbtacks. What I could see wasn't just observational notes. It was an attempt at tactical analysis. He was marking locations, times of day, and species of what he was now calling the observers. There were notes scrawled in the margins. Stellar's J, 1430, Miller's Creek, unresponsive to auditory physical stimuli. Mule deer, 9 o'clock, East Ridge, stationary observation for 17 minutes. Gray squirrel, 11:45, directly overhead, tracking patrol movement. The area around Granite Spire was a dense cluster of red pins, and the entire sector was circled with a thick, angry red marker. He was mapping a network. I backed away, a profound sense of dread settling in my gut. This was beyond strange animal behavior. This was coordinated. This was intelligent. I retreated to the living room, my mind racing. The official explanations for the disappearances felt laughably inadequate now, like trying to explain a bombing raid as a weather phenomenon. The air in the cabin felt stale, confining. Needing to clear my head, I quietly unlatched the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The night was cool and clear, the sky a spray of brilliant stars. The familiar scent of pine and damp earth should have been calming, but it wasn't. I leaned against the railing, taking a deep breath, and my eyes fell on the opposite railing post not 10 feet away. My blood ran cold. It was sitting there, a dark blue silhouette against the faint moonlight. A Stellar's Jay. It could have been the same one, or it could have been another. It didn't matter. It was perfectly still, its head tilted, its invisible gaze locked onto me. It made no sound. It just watched. A primal, irrational fear, the kind I hadn't felt since incoming mortar fire in Iraq, seized me. I didn't shout. I didn't move. I just stared back for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity. Then I slowly backed away, fumbled with the doorknob, and slipped back inside. I shot the deadbolt home with a loud, metallic thunk and leaned against the solid wood of the door, my own heart hammering against my ribs. The watchers were no longer in the deep woods. They were here. 2 days of suffocating tension passed. We performed our duties in a state of hypervigilance, the world outside our truck a hostile, watchful territory. Every deer that froze on a hillside, every hawk circling overhead was no longer a part of the scenery. It was a potential enemy sensor. The silence from John was worse than his frantic theories. He was a tightly coiled spring, his eyes dark-rimmed and hollow. I couldn't take it anymore. During a patrol along a remote trail in the park's northern quadrant, I pulled the truck to an abrupt halt and killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was absolute. "Talk to me, John," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Don't shut me out. I saw your map. I saw the bird on the porch. I'm in this now. So tell me what the hell you think is going on." For a long moment, he just stared out the windshield. His shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. He looked old, tired, and terrified. He reached into his pack on the floor, pulled out the worn, leather-bound journal, and handed it to me. "Read the last 3 entries," he said, his voice raspy. "It'll sound insane." "We're past the point of worrying about insane, John." I opened the journal. His handwriting, usually a neat scientific script, was a jagged scrawl. He laid out a theory that was as brilliant as it was terrifying. He called it a parasitic hive mind. He didn't think the animals were possessed in a supernatural sense. He hypothesized that some kind of microscopic or fungal parasite had infected the entire ecosystem, creating a shared neural network. It didn't control their every action, but it could override their base instincts, turning them into a vast, interconnected sensory web, a living surveillance system. "They're not just individual animals anymore, Caleb," he explained as I read, his voice gaining a flicker of its old academic fervor. "They're nodes, eyes and ears. A squirrel chattering on a branch isn't just a squirrel. It's a sensor, reporting our position to the rest of the network. A deer standing on a ridge isn't frozen in fear. It's a living camera, tracking our movement and relaying the data. They act as a single, coordinated organism with thousands of bodies. I closed the journal, the leather cool against my clammy hands. My Marine training screamed at me to dismiss it, to file it under combat fatigue or psychological stress. But the man in me, the man who had seen the dogs refuse to track and the jay refuse to fly, couldn't. That's impossible. Is it? He challenged. Ants create super colonies. Slime molds can solve mazes. Nature is full of collective intelligence. This is just different, alien. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for belief. Come on, let's take a walk, and this time don't just look. Observe. Skeptical but unnerved, I agreed. I grabbed my 12-gauge shotgun from the rack, the familiar way to small comfort, and we started down the trail. For the first few hundred yards, everything seemed normal. Then John started pointing things out. Up there, he whispered, nodding towards a high meadow. A lone doe stood silhouetted against the sky. She wasn't grazing. She was watching us. We walked for 5 minutes, winding through a stand of aspens, and when we emerged into another clearing, I looked back. The doe was still there, in the exact same spot, her head still turned in our direction. A little further on, a flicker of movement caught my eye. A downy woodpecker was clinging to the side of a dead tree, its head bobbing. As we passed, it flitted to the next tree along the path, then the next and the next, perfectly matching our pace. It was escorting us. I looked up. A squirrel, perched on a thick pine bough directly over the trail, was motionless, its tail a rigid question mark, its black eyes staring straight down at us. The forest was no longer a symphony of random sounds. It had become a coordinated performance of psychological terror. A branch would snap loudly to our right. As my head whipped in that direction, a rustle of leaves would answer from the left. A sudden chatter of a chipmunk up ahead, followed by the dry whisper of something moving through the brush behind us. It was a perfectly timed, multi-directional assault on the senses, designed to keep us off balance, to funnel our attention. They were herding us with sound. The pressure built, a tangible weight in the air. My grip on the shotgun was slick with sweat. My every nerve ending screamed. I felt like a rat in a maze designed by a god. Then, just as the auditory assault reached its crescendo, it stopped. One moment, the woods were alive with this orchestrated harassment. The next, there was absolute, ringing silence. Not a bird chirped, not a squirrel chattered, not a leaf rustled. It was as if a universal mute button had been pressed. The silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. It was unnatural, profound, and full of dreadful anticipation. Every animal, every node in the network had simultaneously gone dark. Into that deafening void, a new sound arose. It came from far away, from the high, jagged ridges in the direction of Granite Spire. It was a howl, but it was like no wolf howl I had ever heard. Not in person, not on any recording. It was deeper, for one, with a resonant, guttural quality that seemed to vibrate in my bones. But it was the complexity of it that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. It wasn't a simple, lonely cry. It rose and fell in complex tones, carrying layers of what sounded like rage and pain and something disturbingly close to a human voice, twisted into a sound of pure, primal dominance. The howl lasted for maybe 10 seconds, echoing off the stone faces of the peaks, and then it faded, leaving the silence even heavier than before. A moment later, as if the switch had been flipped back on, the forest exploded back into sound. The squirrels chattered, the birds called, the rustling in the undergrowth resumed. The network was back online. We stood frozen on the trail, my knuckles white on the shotgun. The brief, terrifying silence and the unearthly howl had scared me more than anything else. It wasn't just one entity we were dealing with. The network of watchers was one thing. This was something else entirely. Something powerful enough to silence the entire forest with its voice alone. We turned and walked back to the truck in stunned silence. Back at the station, John slumped at his desk and made a new entry in his journal. I looked over his shoulder and read the shaky script. They are not just observing, they are hurting. But there is something else. Something they fear. Something that can deafen them. The night was moonless and black, the kind of absolute darkness that exists only far from the glow of cities. I was lost in a shallow, uneasy sleep, dreaming of silent birds with dead black eyes, when a hand clamped down on my shoulder and shook me hard. My eyes snapped open. The silhouette of John stood over my bed, one finger pressed to his lips. "Caleb," he whispered, his voice a strained rasp. "Downstairs. There's something in the house." I was out of bed in an instant, my heart hammering. My training took over, pushing the sleep from my mind. I listened. From the first floor came a series of small, distinct sounds. A soft, rhythmic scratching. A dull thud, like a bag of flour being dropped. A furtive, whispery shuffling. It wasn't the sound of a single intruder. It was too layered, too widespread. I reached for the Glock I kept on my nightstand. The cold, familiar weight was a small comfort. I racked the slide, the sharp shik-shik sound cutting through the silence, and settled my finger high on the frame, ready. John, ever the traditionalist, had armed himself with the heaviest thing he could find, his old-school 4D cell mag light. It was a 6-pound club more than a flashlight, but John never let it go. We moved out of my room like ghosts, our bare feet silent on the wooden floorboards. The sounds from the kitchen grew louder, a clatter of falling silverware, the groan of a cupboard door being pried open. We reached the top of the stairs and peered down into the darkness. I took the lead, pistol held in a two-handed grip, my body tensed. John was right behind me, the mag light held high. We crept down the stairs one by one, each tread groaning under our weight, the sound deafening in the charged silence. At the bottom, I flattened myself against the wall, took a deep breath, and swung into the kitchen doorway. "Freeze, Park Ranger!" John's thumb hit the switch on the mag light, and a powerful beam of white light cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene of such surreal, organized chaos that my brain struggled to process it. The kitchen was teeming with animals. A family of raccoons was on the counter, their nimble paws systematically pulling open boxes of cereal and bags of pasta, scattering the contents onto the floor. 2 gray squirrels were inside an open cabinet, pushing out cans and jars that thudded onto the linoleum. By the refrigerator, a juvenile black bear, maybe 150 pounds, was prying at the door with its claws, its massive shoulders straining with effort. And circling silently near the ceiling, a flash of brilliant blue in the bouncing light beam. A Stellar's jay. They were working, methodically, silently, purposefully. There was no growling from the bear, no chittering from the raccoons, just the quiet, industrious sounds of destruction. My first thought was a bizarre, rabid infestation. But then the beam of the flashlight swept across their faces. The raccoon turned its masked face towards us. The bear paused its efforts and slowly swung its massive head around. The squirrels froze. Their eyes. God, their eyes. They were dull, glassy, and vacant, like the eyes of taxidermy animals. There was no spark of life, no fear, no aggression, no recognition. There was nothing. It was like looking into the optics of a drone, a lens animated by a remote alien will. My command had registered, the light had registered, but the response was one of pure, empty acknowledgement. The hive mind was looking at us through a dozen pairs of eyes. My finger tightened on the trigger of the Glock. The front sight was centered on the bear's chest. I was about to squeeze when the jay, still circling overhead, let out a single sharp, piercing cry. A single sharp cleek. It was a command. Instantly, the entire scene erupted into motion. It wasn't a panicked flight. It was an organized, tactical retreat. The raccoons and squirrels scrambled off the counters and scurried as one towards the large kitchen window. Without hesitation, one of the raccoons hurled its body against the glass, shattering it. The others swarmed through the broken pane and vanished into the night. The bear abandoned the refrigerator, spun around and charged not at us, but at the back door. It hit the wood with the force of a battering ram, splintering the frame and bursting out into the darkness. Within seconds, the kitchen was empty and silent, save for the crunch of broken glass under our feet and the cold night air pouring in. The entire event, from our entrance to their departure, had lasted less than 30 seconds. John swept the light around the ransacked kitchen. Flour, sugar, and cereal covered every surface like a fine layer of snow. Cans and broken jars littered the floor. What were they looking for? He breathed, his voice trembling. My gaze fell upon the kitchen table. Amidst the mess of spilled sugar and scattered coffee grounds, one object sat pristine and untouched, placed dead center. It was a walkie-talkie, the kind used by hikers. I recognized the model instantly. It belonged to the first couple that had gone missing, the one from California. The network had delivered a message, or a trophy. As John stepped forward to examine the radio, my attention was drawn to the back door, hanging crookedly on one hinge. I walked over, my pistol still raised, and looked at the splintered door frame. The bear's claws had torn deep gashes in the wood. But beside them there was another mark. 3 marks. They were perfectly straight, perfectly parallel, and impossibly deep. They looked as if someone had taken a steel rake and gouged it into the ponderosa pine frame with superhuman strength. They weren't the random splayed scratches of a bear. They were precise, deliberate, an intentional symbol left in the wreckage. A warning. John came up behind me, saw the marks, and took a sharp breath. He pulled out his phone and took several pictures, his hands shaking. The message hadn't been from one source. It was from 2. The hive mind had left the radio, a token of its power over the lost tourists. But something else had been here. Something that had left a sigil of its own. Later in his journal, John's new entry was short and chilling. The network came for our maps, our intel. They think we know something, but they weren't alone tonight. Something else was here. Not a watcher. A player. It left a warning. For them or for us. Neither of us really slept after the invasion of our cabin. We spent the remaining hours of darkness cataloging the damage and boarding up the broken door and window, fueled by adrenaline and black coffee. We might have managed an hour or 2 of fitful catnapping on our bunks, but the next morning still dawned gray and oppressive. The air was heavy with unspoken dread. We drove in silence, The wreckage of our kitchen, a stark image, burned into our minds. John had radioed in a report about a problem bear to explain the damage, a lie that felt flimsy and pathetic. We both knew the truth. Our sanctuary had been breached. We were no longer just observers of the phenomenon. We were targets. As we rounded a bend on the main park road, we saw a minivan pulled over at the trailhead for the Aspen Creek Loop, a moderate family-friendly trail. A man, a woman, and 2 kids, a boy and a girl, maybe 10 and 12, were slathering on sunscreen and adjusting their brightly colored backpacks. The Winters family, according to the minivan's proud family stickers. A cold knot of fear tightened in my stomach. John hit the brakes, pulling the truck alongside them. He leaned across me, his face a mask of grim urgency. "Folks, I'm sorry, but we're closing this section of the park for the day," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We've had reports of unusually aggressive animal activity in the area. It's not safe." The father, a sunburned man in a brand new hiking outfit, frowned. "Aggressive? What, like a bear?" "Bears, mountain lions, everything," John said, his eyes wide and sincere. "Please, for your family's safety, I need you to pack up and head back to the visitor center. We'll refund your park pass." The man exchanged an annoyed look with his wife. "We drove all the way from Ohio for this. The kids were really looking forward to it." "Are you sure it's that serious?" "I have never been more serious in my life," John pleaded, his voice cracking slightly. "Sir, please, get your family in the car and leave." The man sighed, a long, put-upon sound. All right, I'm Mark Winters. If you say so, Ranger." He started to herd his disappointed kids back toward the minivan. We watched them for a moment. Then, satisfied they were leaving, I put the truck in gear, and we continued down the road. We had traveled maybe 200 yards. The first scream was high and piercing, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror that cut through the morning stillness like a scalpel. It was the woman, Sarah. It was followed instantly by a chorus of other sounds. Mark's guttural shout of rage and fear, the terrified shrieks of the children, and another sound, a chittering, growling, hissing cacophony that rose from the forest floor. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the asphalt. We threw our doors open and ran. I chambered around in my shotgun as I sprinted, the shuck-shuck sound brutally loud in the sudden silence between screams. We burst back into the trailhead clearing and stumbled into a scene from a nightmare. The Winters family hadn't made it to their van. They were being swarmed. It was the entire forest, weaponized. A cloud of jays and crows swirled around them, not just screeching but diving, pecking at their faces and eyes. Squirrels and chipmunks, their teeth bared, scrambled up their legs, biting and clawing. Raccoons and foxes darted in from the undergrowth, a tide of fur and teeth, snapping at their ankles and pulling them down. It was a coordinated, tactical assault. They weren't trying to kill them, not right away. They were disabling them, immobilizing them. A fox latched onto Mark's calf, dragging him to the ground. A raccoon leaped onto Sarah's back, forcing her to her knees. And then, with horrifying efficiency, the larger animals began to drag the screaming, bloody family off the paved parking area, away from the trail, and into the deep woods. They were being abducted, live. "No!" I roared, and raised the shotgun. The first shell in the chamber was always a low brass birdshot load, for scaring off small critters without causing too much damage. I fired the blast into a knot of raccoons pulling on the little girl's arm. The shot tore through them, sending bodies tumbling, but for every one I hit, 3 more surged forward to take its place. John was beside me. his Glock barking, firing controlled pairs into the thickest parts of the swarm. The small animals fell, but the tide was overwhelming. A lynx, its eyes utterly devoid of life and fixed on me with cold intent, leaped from the branch of an oak tree. I swung the stock of the shotgun like a baseball bat, connecting with its skull with a sickening crunch. It dropped at my feet and was immediately trampled by a fresh wave of attackers. We were losing. They were going to take all of them. Then, in the chaotic blur of fur and feathers and screaming, I saw it, or thought I saw it. Deeper in the woods, just past where two coyotes were dragging the boy by his jacket, there was a flicker of movement. A massive dark shape, moving with an impossible fluid speed. It was bigger than a bear, and it moved with the grace of a wolf. For a split second, it broke from the shadows, a blur of dark fur and coiled muscle. It slammed into the two coyotes, sending them flying with a force that snapped their spines. The motion was so fast, so violent, it was like a localized explosion. The intervention was momentary, a flash of brutal violence that wasn't part of the hive mind's attack. My brain, overloaded with adrenaline and horror, wrote it off as another bear or a trick of the light. But that single chaotic instant created a seam in the attack. It broke the swarm's focus on the boy for just long enough. "The boy! Grab the boy!" John yelled, firing to cover me. I plunged forward, kicking a snarling badger out of my way, and grabbed the terrified teenager under his arms. John got his hands on the father, who was bleeding from a dozen deep bites. Together we dragged them backward, away from the tree line, toward the relative safety of the road. The moment we had them clear, the attack stopped. As suddenly as it began, it was over. The animals, the birds, the entire living tide melted back into the forest. The woods fell silent, leaving only the sobbing of Mark and his son, and our own ragged breathing. Sarah and the little girl, Lily, were gone. We half-carried, half-dragged the two survivors to our truck. They were in shock, covered in blood, theirs and the animals', their bodies trembling uncontrollably. As I helped Mark into the passenger seat, I looked back at the forest. It was still, silent, watching. They had let us go. They had let us save two of them. It wasn't a failed attack. It was a demonstration, a message. This is our power. This is what we can do. We can take anyone we want, anytime we want. And we were powerless to stop them. I floored the gas pedal, the F-150's engine screaming as we careened down the winding park road. The speedometer needle quivered past 80 miles per hour on stretches of road. I normally wouldn't dare take over 40. In the back, John was doing his best to practice battlefield medicine, pressing field dressings against the deepest wounds on Mark and his son. Mark was in deep shock, muttering a stream of disconnected words. The eyes, so many eyes, they were quiet. They didn't make a sound. His son was silent, his face a pale, tear-streaked mask of catatonia. We roared into the main ranger station complex, gravel flying from under the tires. I left the truck running and burst through the door into the main office, heading straight for the communications room. Sharon, our unflappable 60-something dispatcher, looked up from her crossword puzzle, her eyes widening at the sight of me. I was covered in blood, my uniform torn, my face wild. "Sharon, get the county on the horn, now!" I yelled, my voice raw, and grabbed the backup radio handset from its cradle. I keyed the mic, my hands shaking. "Whispering Peaks Ranger 1 to County Dispatch, we have a 10-00, I repeat, a 10-00 at the Aspen Creek trailhead." The dispatcher's voice that crackled back was calm, professional, and confused. Ranger 1, say again in plain language. 10 codes are no longer authorized. The bureaucratic correction at this moment was like a physical blow. Damn it! I roared into the handset. Officer needs assistance. Mass casualty event, trailhead at Aspen Creek Loop, hostile animal attack, multiple species. Ranger 1, please clarify, the voice came back, laced with skepticism. Did you say animal attack? Multiple species? Yes, goddammit! All of them! I shouted, my composure shattering. The whole damn forest attacked a family. They took 2 of them. We have 2 survivors, critical injuries. Send ambulances, send the sheriff, send everybody. There was a long pause on the other end. Ranger 1, are you compromised? Have you been injured? Your report is irregular. The calm disbelief was too much. With a yell of pure frustration, I slammed the heavy radio handset down onto the console, cracking the plastic casing. It was useless. They thought I was crazy. John came in, his own face and shirt stained with blood. They're stable for now. Did you get through? They think I'm hallucinating, I spat. It took 40 agonizingly long minutes for the first patrol car to arrive, a county sheriff's deputy driving cautiously, probably expecting to find a ranger having a psychotic break. The deputy, a young guy I'd seen around, stepped out of his car, hand resting on his sidearm. His jaw dropped when he saw the state of our truck, the blood-soaked interior, and the 2 survivors John was tending to. His skepticism vanished, replaced by wide-eyed shock. He fumbled for his radio, his voice now urgent and strained. Dispatch, get a medic here now and notify the sheriff. This is real. Within the hour, the ranger station looked like a major disaster zone. 2 ambulances, 4 sheriff's cruisers, and a state police vehicle crowded the parking lot. The surviving father and son were rushed away, their sirens wailing as they sped toward the hospital in Kalispell. Sheriff Brody, a big man with a weary face who'd seen just about everything in his 30 years of law enforcement, cornered me and John in my office. We told him everything. The watchers, the coordinated behavior, the vacant eyes, the organized abduction, the dark shape in the woods. As we spoke, I could see the conflict on his face. He knew me. He knew John. He knew we weren't prone to hysterics or fabrication, but our story was the stuff of madmen. Then the forensic team called him over. They had been examining the wounds on the survivors' discarded clothing. "Sheriff," one of them said, holding up a torn shirt with a pair of evidence tongs. "The lab will have to confirm, but these bite marks, I'm seeing canine, feline, rodent. Hell, it looks like this man was attacked by a whole damn zoo." Brody stared at the shirt, then back at us. The last of his disbelief seemed to evaporate, replaced by a deep, troubled fear. It was then that his secure satellite phone buzzed at his hip. He answered it, his face growing grimmer with every passing second. He said little, mostly "yes, sir," and "I understand." When he hung up, he looked like a man who had been handed a death sentence. He looked at his deputies, then at us. "This entire event is now a federal matter. We are to hand over all evidence and reports. We are to speak to no one about what happened here. No one. Is that understood?" His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. He was following an order he didn't understand from a power he couldn't see. What we didn't know then was that a specialized unit designed for agro-terror or zoonotic threats had been on high alert at Fairchild Air Force Base for weeks, ever since the 3rd disappearance. They weren't just responding, they were already coiled to strike. Before we could even process Brody's words, they started to arrive. A convoy of black, unmarked Chevrolet Suburbans rolled up the park road, their tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. Men in dark tailored suits and others in unmarked military-style fatigues began to emerge. They moved with a quiet, unnerving efficiency, immediately establishing a perimeter, cutting off access to the station. One of the men in a suit, his face impassive and cold, approached Sheriff Brody, presented some form of identification, and spoke in a low voice. A moment later, Brody and his men were packing up, ordered to leave. They were being evicted from their own jurisdiction. The man in the suit then turned to me and John. "Caleb Hayes? John Devereaux? You're to come with me. This park is now under a strict federal quarantine. Official story: an outbreak of a highly aggressive airborne variant of rabies." He looked out at the vast, silent peaks. Whispering Peaks National Park is, as of this moment, closed to the public, indefinitely. We were escorted not to an interrogation room, but to a pristine white mobile medical module that had been erected with frightening speed next to our station. The air inside hummed with the sound of filtration systems and smelled sterile like a hospital. The men in suits were gone, replaced by people in lab coats and military fatigues bearing a strange insignia. A stylized atom surrounded by a broken chain. A tall, imposing man in a crisp uniform entered the module. His name tag read Vance. His rank, Major. He had the cold, pragmatic eyes of a career soldier and a jaw that looked like it was carved from granite. He regarded us not as people, but as contaminated evidence that needed to be processed. "I'm Major Elias Vance," he said, his voice a low baritone that tolerated no argument. "I'm the operational commander for the Anomalous Biological Containment Unit. You two are now under our jurisdiction. You will answer our questions fully and truthfully. Your cooperation is not optional." Before we could respond, another man entered. He was the polar opposite of Vance, slender, with a shock of unruly gray hair, wearing a rumpled lab coat over a tweed jacket. His eyes, however, were sharp and intensely curious, darting around the room, taking everything in. "Easy, Elias," the newcomer said, his voice calm and academic. "They're not enemy combatants. They're witnesses, and quite possibly the most important ones we have." He extended a hand to us. "Dr. Eris Holloway. I'm the lead xenobiologist for the ABCU. Please have a seat." The debriefing lasted for hours. Major Vance's questions were tactical: patrol routes, weapon loadouts, response times. Dr. Holloway's were different. He leaned forward, his eyes alight with an unnerving intellectual hunger, as we described the mechanical movements of the jay, the coordinated sound herding, the vacant eyes of the animals. When John, hesitant at first, handed over his journal, Holloway treated it not as the ravings of a madman, but as a sacred text. He devoured John's notes, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Parasitic neural network. Incredible," Holloway muttered, tracing the map John had made. "The sheer processing power required. It doesn't just influence them, it commands them. A perfect, distributed intelligence system. A biological drone network." He looked up from the journal, his expression one of awe, not fear. "Your theory, Mr. Devereaux, is not insane. I believe it's frighteningly accurate." Meanwhile, the ranger station had been transformed into a full-blown military command post. Soldiers from a specialized unit, their armor emblazoned with the same broken chain insignia and the word Echo, were setting up equipment. A nondescript EW truck, its roof bristling with antennas, had parked at the park entrance, silently blanketing a 5-mile radius and killing all cellular and Wi-Fi signals. The surviving father and son had been rushed away, but not before their phones and any personal electronics were politely but firmly confiscated by the men in suits for biocontainment analysis. There would be no frantic calls to relatives, no TikToks of the bloody aftermath. Major Vance was a whirlwind of motion, directing the deployment of sensors, drones, and personnel. His approach was clear. Identify the threat, isolate it, and neutralize it. To him, the park was a hostile zone to be pacified by overwhelming force. There was a palpable tension between the two men. Vance saw us, two small-town rangers, as civilian liabilities. He wanted us quarantined and debriefed, then shipped out. Holloway, however, argued forcefully that our on-the-ground experience was invaluable. "Major, these men have survived inside the operational zone for months," Holloway insisted during one heated exchange we overheard. "They've observed the enemy's behavior patterns up close. Their intuition is worth more than a dozen satellite sweeps. They are our primary intelligence asset." Holloway won for the moment. We were put in a state of advisory lockdown, confined to the station but asked to consult on the data pouring in. The first drone feeds were chilling. From high above, the thermal imaging showed animal populations moving in unnatural ways. Herds of elk and deer weren't grazing. They were forming vast, slowly rotating geometric patterns in meadows like living crop circles. They were patrolling, creating a living, breathing perimeter fence. The drones focused on the sector we had identified. Granite Spire. The thermal readings there were anomalous. The ground temperature around the base of the rock formation was several degrees higher than the surrounding area, with no geological explanation. Then came the most disturbing footage. Several times, the high-altitude drones picked up what the operators called smeared signatures. Blurry, oblong heat blooms, moving at speeds exceeding 50 miles per hour, appearing from the dense forest, racing across scree fields where no vehicle could go, and then vanishing directly into the solid rock face of the spire. Dr. Holloway pulled up the drone footage on a large monitor, placing it alongside a photo of John's journal entry about the anomalously large canids and the strange plantigrade tracks. He then added the photo John had taken of the 3 parallel claw marks on our doorframe. "This is not the network," Holloway said, tapping the screen showing the smeared heat signature. "This is something else. The howl you heard, Caleb, that deafened the network? The mark on your door? The momentary intervention during the attack on the tourists? It's all connected." He paced in front of the monitors, his mind clearly racing. "We are not dealing with one anomalous threat. We are dealing with 2. The hive mind entity is one. But there is a second faction, a third party. A highly mobile, powerful, and seemingly territorial predator, or group of predators that is not part of the network. In fact, based on your accounts, it appears to be hostile to it." Major Vance, who had been listening with a stony expression, stepped forward. "A second threat complicates the mission." "Or," Holloway countered, "it provides an opportunity. We need to know what's at the heart of that network, and we need to know what this third party is." Vance stared at the map, his jaw tight. The red circle around Granite Spire was the epicenter of all the weirdness. He made his decision. "All right, we're done waiting. Echo Squad will conduct a reconnaissance in force. We push into the Granite Spire sector. We make contact, we draw them out, and we see what we're really up against." He turned to his comms officer. "Prep Echo Squad, we're going hunting." Echo Squad moved out at dawn. They weren't walking. They were rolling in 2 heavily armored, all-terrain infantry carriers that looked more like small tanks than trucks. 12 soldiers, clad in matte black exoskeletal combat armor, their helmets concealing their faces, their rifles bristling with advanced optics. It was a terrifying display of military power, designed to crush any conceivable biological threat. John and I watched their progress on a bank of monitors in the newly established command center, a knot of apprehension tightening in my chest. Dr. Holloway stood beside us, his face a mixture of clinical curiosity and deep concern. Major Vance directed the operation from a command console, his voice a calm, steady stream of orders. The forest was silent. The drone overhead showed no animal movement. No deer on the hillsides, no birds in the trees. The network was hiding, waiting. "It's too quiet," John murmured, his eyes glued to the lead soldier's helmet cam feed. "They know we're coming. They're letting us in." The convoy rumbled to a halt about half a mile from the base of Granite Spire. The soldiers dismounted, forming a wide perimeter, and advancing on foot, their movements precise and economical. They swept through the woods, weapons at the ready, a silent, deadly intrusion. "Command, Echo 1, I've got movement," a voice crackled over the comms. The helmet cam of the lead soldier, a sergeant named Reyes, swiveled to the right. "Thermal is lighting up. Single signature, large, bipedal, behind that rock formation." "Hold position," Vance ordered. "Identify the target." "It's humanoid, Command, but big, 7, maybe 8 feet tall." Reyes's breathing was steady, but there was a new tension in his voice. "It's not moving, just watching. Engage if it displays hostile." Vance's order was cut off by a sudden violent roar of static. Reyes's camera feed lurched violently as he screamed. It wasn't a scream of pain, but of pure shock. A dark, impossibly fast shape had exploded from the shadows of the rocks. Before anyone could react, the feed showed a brief, terrifying close-up of a clawed hand, thick with coarse black fur, swiping at the camera. Then, a wet, crunching sound, and the feed went dead. "Reyes is down!" another soldier yelled. "Contact! Contact!" The forest erupted. From behind trees, from the shadows of boulders, from depressions in the ground, they emerged. They were huge, powerfully built creatures that moved with a terrifying blend of human intelligence and animal ferocity. They stood on 2 legs, their bodies a corded mass of muscle covered in thick, dark fur. Their heads were lupine, with elongated snouts full of dagger-like teeth, but their eyes burned with a cold, yellow, intelligent light. They were werewolves, but the term felt wholly inadequate. These were not mindless beasts. They were warriors. Echo Squad was composed of elite soldiers, but they were trained to fight humans and animals, not mythical creatures come to life. Their assault rifles roared, spitting fire into the woods, but the bullets seemed to have little effect. The creatures moved with blurring speed, shrugging off hits that would have dropped a grizzly bear, closing the distance with terrifying bounds. We watched in horror as the helmet cams relayed a scene of brutal, one-sided combat. One of the creatures leaped onto a soldier. We watched in horror as its claws, impossibly sharp and dense, tore through the composite plating of his exosuit. The armor, designed to stop rifle rounds, shredded like aluminum foil under an attack that had the force and penetration of an anti-material weapon. Another grabbed a soldier's rifle and bent the barrel in its massive hands before flinging the man into a tree with enough force to splinter the trunk. They weren't just attacking. They were fighting with tactical precision, using the terrain for cover, flanking the squad, systematically dismantling them. They were driving the soldiers back, away from Granite Spire, as if protecting a sacred site. The squad leader, a captain by the name of Thorne, was trying to rally his men, his voice strained over the comms. "Fall back! Form a defensive circle! Concentrated fire!" He raised his rifle to fire at a massive wolf creature that was advancing on him, the clear leader of the pack. It was larger than the others, its fur shot through with streaks of silver gray. It didn't charge. It just stopped 20 feet away and stared at him. Suddenly, Captain Thorne cried out, dropping his rifle and clutching his helmet. "Ah, God, it's in my head." He screamed into the radio, his voice ragged with pain and disbelief. It's speaking. It's telling us to get out, to leave. It says we'll wake the Weaver. Don't wake the Weaver." The transmission dissolved into a pained groan. Then silence. The captain's camera feed showed him collapsing to his knees, incapacitated, but, as we would later learn from the debriefing of the survivors, not dead. The message had been delivered. In the command center, the blood had drained from Major Vance's face. He had sent his best men, armed with the best technology, into a meat grinder. The enemy wasn't just physically superior, it was intelligent, tactical, and apparently telepathic. "All Echo units, this is command. Disengage. I say again, disengage. Retreat to the extraction point, immediate effect. Pop smoke and fall back." Vance's voice was iron, but I could hear the shock underneath it. The surviving soldiers threw smoke grenades, and the feeds dissolved into gray chaos. They dragged their wounded and retreated, harried every step of the way by the dark shapes in the smoke. Echo Squad limped back to the APCs, having lost 3 soldiers killed and 5 more grievously wounded. The command center was silent, save for the hum of the electronics. The shock was absolute. Dr. Holloway stared at the dead monitor that had shown Captain Thorne's feed. "The third party," he whispered, his voice full of awe and terror. "They aren't just another predator. They're guardians. They're protecting something they call the Weaver." He looked at me and John. "The network is the infection. These creatures, they're the antibodies." The disastrous failure of Echo Squad forced a paradigm shift in the command center. Brute force was not an option. The Guardians, as Holloway now called them, were an insurmountable obstacle on the surface. Major Vance, humbled and furious, was forced to concede that a tactical rethink was necessary. They needed to bypass the Guardians. It was Holloway who found the potential solution. Buried deep in the park's archives, he'd found old geological survey maps from a mining company that had prospected in the area in the 1920s. The maps detailed an extensive, uncharted network of limestone caves, with a marked entrance on the far side of the granite spire massif, miles away from where Echo Squad had been ambushed. The theory was simple. If they couldn't go over the Guardians, they would go under them. A new, much smaller team was formed, a stealth insertion. The mission was no longer about neutralization but pure reconnaissance. Find the source of the network, the Weaver, and get out. The team consisted of Major Vance himself, refusing to send more men to their deaths without seeing the threat firsthand. Dr. Holloway, who insisted his scientific expertise was non-negotiable. 4 of the remaining less injured Echo Squad soldiers, their exosuits stripped down for mobility. And to my own disbelief, me and John. "You know the terrain better than my satellites," Vance had said, his voice clipped. "And you've seen these things. You'll know if something is wrong before my sensors do. You're our early warning system?" We found the cave entrance hidden behind a curtain of ancient ivy, a dark, gaping mouth in the side of the mountain. The air that breathed out of it was cold and damp, carrying an organic, cloying smell like rotting mushrooms and ozone. We switched on our helmet and shoulder-mounted lights, their beams cutting into a darkness that felt absolute. The walls of the cave weren't natural rock. They were coated in a strange gray-green substance that seemed to pulse with a faint, internal bioluminescence. It was a living lining, a carpet of alien biomass that covered every surface. It felt slick and slightly warm to the touch. We moved deeper. The only sounds the crunch of our boots and our own ragged breathing. The narrow passage soon opened into a series of larger tunnels, and here we found the cave's own sentries. Perched on ledges and hanging from the ceiling were cave crickets, bats, and blind salamanders. But like the animals on the surface, their eyes, or where their eyes should have been, glowed with a faint, sickly green light. They were motionless, living motion detectors. Their presence reported instantly to the hive mind we were trying to find. The network extended even here, deep beneath the earth. "We've tripped the alarm," one of the soldiers whispered over the private comms channel. "Keep moving," Vance ordered. We knew this was a one-way trip. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened up into a cavern of truly epic proportions. The ceiling was lost in the darkness hundreds of feet above us, bristling with stalactites that looked like the teeth of some colossal beast. The entire cavern, from floor to ceiling, was interwoven with the pulsing, phosphorescent biomass, forming thick, cable-like structures that crisscrossed the vast space. The entire cave was a single living organism. It was a lair. And in the center of it all, suspended in a monstrous web of these biological cables, hung the heart of the network. The Weaver. It was the size of a school bus, a grotesque, pulsating sack of chitinous plates, translucent flesh, and glowing green ganglia. It was a nightmare of alien biology, a parasitic god-king that had made this mountain its throne. Its rhythmic pulsations sent waves of light through the network of fibers connected to it, like a monstrous heart pumping poison through a million veins. Then we saw the cocoons. Hanging from the ceiling all around the central chamber, suspended by thinner strands of the same fibrous material, were dozens of vaguely human-shaped pods. They were semi-translucent, and in the ghastly green light, we could see the shapes of people inside. The missing hikers, the young couple from California, the college kids, the Winters family, and, to our horror, the 3 missing soldiers from Echo Squad. Their bodies were still, their faces locked in silent screams, as thin tendrils from the cocoon slowly, methodically, assimilated them into the quivering biomass. They weren't just being held captive, they were being dissolved, consumed, their organic matter repurposed by the Weaver. Holloway raised a handheld scanner, his face a mask of horrified fascination. My God, it's converting them, using their biomass to grow. As he moved to get a better reading, his foot dislodged a loose stone. The small clatter was insignificant, but in the silent living cavern, it was like a gunshot. The Weaver reacted. The slow, rhythmic pulsing of the central mass stuttered, then sped up, the green light flaring violently. A low, psychic hum filled the air, pressing in on our skulls. From the walls around us, the biomass began to writhe and form new shapes. Thick, whip-like tentacles, tipped with sharpened bone, lashed out from the cavern walls. And from the tunnels we had come from, we heard a chittering, skittering sound. The cave's infected fauna, the bats and insects, were swarming toward us, called to defend their master. "It's awake!" Vance yelled. "Sergeant, plant the charge? We're sterilizing this entire cavern. Thermobaric device now." One of the Echo soldiers unslung a heavy pack and ran toward the base of the Weaver's web. "Charge is planted. It's on a radio-linked dead man's switch, Major, he yelled back. If our suit vitals all flatline, it arms and detonates. We can also trigger it remotely from your console. The rest of us raised our weapons as the first of the tentacles whipped through the air, aimed directly at us. The cavern descended into sheer, multi-front chaos. Our rifles roared, spitting streams of fire at the lashing tentacles and the tide of skittering, green-eyed cave creatures. Vance and his soldiers formed a tight defensive perimeter, their movements a testament to their brutal training. John and I were back to back, my shotgun bucking against my shoulder, John's pistol barking in the cavern's echoing acoustics. Just as the team was secure, the other shoe dropped. The main entrances to the cavern, tunnels we hadn't even noticed in the gloom, were suddenly blocked by massive, dark figures. The Guardians, the werewolves. They had followed us, or perhaps they had another way in. They poured into the cavern, a dozen strong, led by the huge, silver-flecked Alpha we had seen on the monitors. The battle immediately became a horrifying three-way war. We were firing at the Weaver's tentacles. The Guardians, ignoring us for the moment, launched themselves at the Weaver's defenses with savage fury, their claws and teeth tearing through the thick biomass with far more effect than our bullets. And the Weaver, in turn, lashed out at everything that moved, its tentacles and swarms of cave creatures attacking both humans and Guardians with mindless impartiality. In the midst of this maelstrom, the Alpha moved with a purpose that transcended the chaos. He wasn't just fighting. He was cutting a path. He bowled over two of his own pack who were in his way and slammed into a writhing tentacle, tearing it in half. His target was us. He broke through our defensive line and skidded to a halt directly in front of me and John. I raised my shotgun, the barrel inches from his snarling lupine face. But he didn't attack. He just stared at us, his intelligent yellow eyes burning into mine. And then a voice echoed in my head, not as a sound, but as a flood of pure, raw information. It wasn't like the captain's painful experience. This was controlled, deliberate. Do not detonate the weapon. Images, not words, flooded my consciousness. I saw a sky filled with stars, a rock falling, burning through the atmosphere. I saw a crater, and inside it, the nascent form of the Weaver. I saw ancient people, the Alpha's ancestors, their forms shifting between man and wolf. They weren't cursed, they were protectors. They made a pact, not with the creature, but with the earth itself to become its guardians. They fought the Weaver, and unable to kill it, they used their own strange power, a kind of sonic, ritualistic resonance, to lull it into a deep slumber, burying it within the mountain. The fire will not kill it, the thought voice explained, laced with desperation. It will only sever its tethers to this place. A violent death will trigger a final defensive spasm. It will release its spores. A billion seeds, carried on the wind to infect the entire world. We do not kill it. We lull it. We make it sleep again. I staggered back, my mind reeling from the psychic data burst. I looked at John and saw from his wide, terrified eyes that he had received the same message. Major Vance looked from us to the Alpha Werewolf, then to the armed thermobaric charge at the base of the web. His face was a mask of conflict. His orders were clear: neutralize the threat. That meant detonating the bomb. Believing a monster's telepathic plea over a direct order was career suicide, if not treason. "Vance, don't do it," I yelled, my voice hoarse. "It's a planetary extinction event if that thing blows." "My orders are to eliminate the primary threat," Vance roared back over the din of battle. "And that thing is the primary threat." He made his choice. He was a soldier. He followed orders. He was about to key his radio to give the override command for remote detonation. I didn't think. I just reacted to the images in my head, to the sight of the cocoons, to the stark terror in the Alpha's message. I spun, raised my Glock, and fired. The bullet slammed into the receiver unit on the side of the thermobaric device, shattering the antenna and critical components. The small red-armed light died. Vance stared at me, his face a thundercloud of pure fury. "Hayes, what have you done?" "There's another way!" I screamed, gesturing with the pistol towards the Alpha. "They're not the enemy, they're the solution." For a split second, Vance looked like he was going to shoot me. But then a massive tentacle swept down, and one of the Guardians intercepted it, saving an Echo soldier's life. Vance saw it. He saw the werewolves fighting with a desperate efficiency that his own men couldn't match. Their only goal, the suppression of the Weaver. With a curse that was ripped from his soul, he made a new choice. "All Echo units," he commanded, his voice strained. "Cease fire on the friendlies, provide covering fire, protect the Guardians." An unspoken battlefield truce was forged in that instant. The soldiers turned their fire solely on the Weaver's defenses, while the werewolves, now unhindered, moved to the center of the cavern. They formed a circle around the pulsating, enraged Weaver. Then they began to howl. It wasn't the sound of rage from the forest. This was different. It was a complex, layered, resonant chant, a deep, thrumming harmony that vibrated through the very rock beneath our feet. The Weaver recoiled, the violent thrashing of its tentacles slowing as the sonic waves washed over it. Its angry green light began to dim, the frantic pulse slowing to a crawl. The Guardians were singing it to sleep. The entrance must be sealed. The Alpha's voice echoed in our minds, weaker now, strained from the effort. The ritual will hold it, but the way must be closed. We will bring the mountain down upon it, upon us. Go. Now. Vance didn't hesitate. "Everyone out! Move!" We scrambled back through the tunnels, the Guardian's hypnotic chant fading behind us. As we burst out of the cave mouth into the gray light of dawn, a deep, grinding roar began from within the mountain. The ground shuddered violently. We threw ourselves flat as the entire face of Granite Spire groaned, cracked, and then collapsed inward, a cataclysmic avalanche of rock and earth that sealed the cave entrance forever. Silence fell. The only sound was the wind whispering through the peaks. In his official report, Major Vance wrote that the primary biological entity had been successfully neutralized via a targeted geological event, a cave-in caused by their ordnance. The official narrative would speak of the tragic disappearance of Sarah and Lily Winters, lost in the ensuing rock slides. The Guardians were never mentioned. The existence of the ABCU and the truth of Whispering Peaks was buried under a mountain of classified documents. John and I were honorably discharged from the Park Service, with a generous pension and a non-disclosure agreement so terrifying it felt like it was written in blood. We still live in a small town just outside the park's permanent quarantine zone. Sometimes at night, I look up at the scarred, broken face of Granite Spire. I know the Weaver isn't dead. It's just sleeping. And I know that deep beneath the rock, an ancient pack of monsters sacrificed themselves to keep it that way. The world is safe, for now, not because of our weapons or our technology, but because we chose to trust one monster to fight another. And some nights when the wind is just right, I think I can almost hear a faint, lingering echo of their howl in the peaks, a lonely, eternal vigil.